Welcome to One Word Stories. My name is Joanna Zell. And in this episode 40, I'm really happy and thrilled to host Darla Dierdorf. A very warm welcome, Darla.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your invitation.
Darla, when I researched how I could introduce you, I said, okay, of course, an author of books I'm familiar with, and I really appreciate that you have written them. You teach at a couple of universities, above all in North Carolina at the State University, but also in South Africa at the Nelson Mandela University, Meiji University in Japan, Shanghai International Studies University in China, the faculty of Howard University's Global Education Think Tank, faculty for Howard Future of Learning Institute, where you are coming with your expertise, with your knowledge, and above all, with fantastic insights how we can deepen intercultural competence. And one of your most recent insights is that it could actually happen through story circles. And this is the last publication, the Manual for Developing Intercultural Competencies. The story circles you have published actually 2020, so not long ago for UNESCO. And this is also the reason why I'm really happy that we can talk about working in story circles. So Darla, how did your journey start? What brought you to this point from developing the models of intercultural competence to exchange of stories?
Well, actually, the starting point goes much farther back for me. I'm always fascinated by how people got into doing what they do. And when asked this question about how did I come to do this work, it really goes way back for me in terms of it be this work being motivated by my faith background and in looking at what does being a peacemaker look like and mean, and what does that mean vocationally. And so this work is very much grounded in my faith values. And so even as a doctoral student, when I was looking to see, well, what should I be researching for my doctoral dissertation, I went back to these faith values that have grounded me for my whole life. And so then my dissertation, while yes, it was on intercultural competence and resulted in one of the first research-based frameworks of intercultural competence. What I see my dissertation was about, and all my work since then, is looking at what is necessary for us to get along together as humans sharing this planet. For me, that's what this work that I've done is all about. And that's what continues to drive me. And that's what's motivated me all the way through with this work. So that's what led to my doctoral dissertation research with this framework, this first research-based framework on intercultural competence. That's what's led to all the other work that I continue to do, including and especially this work that I've been doing with UNESCO for over the last decade. And most recently, this work is particularly around using stories to develop and practice intercultural competencies. So that's how the manual came about. And it's just been an incredibly rich work in doing this with UNESCO. As we first piloted story circles around the world in all 5 UNESCO regions pre-pandemic, and then have been able to continue to use these UNESCO story circles virtually online with in training United Nations staff, UNHCR staff, those who work with refugees. And one of the most recent iterations was with peacekeepers in Mali.
Yeah. I love it. I love it because this is exactly what you have just emphasized, that when we work just with the theories, when we work with just models, this is the first step. Yeah, people understand it at the cognitive level, and they obviously are happy because they develop also, yes, new skills at this cognitive level, actually. However, the moment when they are invited to share their experiences, to tell their own stories, they start to communicate at the emotional level, and magic happens.
I have seen it time after time. That's absolutely right. And it's, in some ways, it's been amazing at how successful and impactful UNESCO story circles have been. But in some ways it's not, because as we know, stories do so much more than just convey information, that they really connect people. And so I think for those who are engaged, for example, in intercultural training or any kind of training, there's a limit to where knowledge can go. Knowledge is very important, obviously, but it's also important to connect deeply through our emotions, and stories allow us to do that.
So when you think of facilitators, so these people who actually offer the space and invite people to share their stories in the story circles, the best size of the group is actually 3, maximum 5 people, so that there is this chance that every voice is heard. Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, well, so we've tried it now, and we have found actually that whether you're in person or online, groups of 4 to 6 work best. So no more than 6, and generally no fewer than 4, because you don't quite get the richness of the stories then if you're only hearing 2 others. So 4 to 6 people in a circle, in a group, but it's scalable. I have done this online with over 400 participants in China, for example. So it's really scalable, as long as people can go into groups of 4 to 6. A little bit of the backstory on how this came about within UNESCO, that I had been working with UNESCO in different intercultural competency projects, as I mentioned, for quite a number of years, including a publication that came out in 2013 called Intercultural Competencies. Anyone can download it from UNESCO. And I worked with several others from around the world on that particular publication. And then, from what I understood, member states, countries, nations came back to UNESCO and said, thanks for this, because it had practical suggestions of what could be done on different levels of society and so on. But they wanted something more concrete, to say, well, how can we actually develop intercultural competencies? And so that's when UNESCO came back to me, and we began to work on this, and started with interviews and focus groups all over the world to see what would work best. And of course, I've been doing intercultural training for years. I put together a book with a colleague, had 50 some activities on developing intercultural competencies, but none of that fit the criteria that UNESCO was looking for, because they were looking for something that could be used with any group of people anywhere in the world, using little to no resources, and that could be facilitated really by anyone. You didn't need to have a special degree or training or background in intercultural communication. So that's really tough to think, well, what is it that could meet those criteria? And again, like as I mentioned, the book of 50 some activities that a colleague I put together, none of that fit the criteria. A lot of intercultural training wouldn't fit that. And so through these interviews and focus groups, what emerged, 2 things. 1, stories. that have been around for as long as humans have been around. And two, through circles. Circles having existed in indigenous cultures for centuries. And to note that circles have, even in the last century, come more into the mainstream of societies. And there are circles for many different purposes now. We can find talking circles that are used by teachers in elementary school classrooms every day. There are restorative justice circles, peacemaking circles, healing circles. There are so many different kinds of circles for different purposes. And so what we did through UNESCO is the first time that circles are being used for the purpose of developing and practicing intercultural competencies. And it's really important to understand what the purpose is, right? And then we do that through the sharing of personal stories because everyone has a story to share from their own life experience. And it's important there to note that oftentimes when people hear storytelling, they think of the performative nature of storytelling. That's not the purpose of UNESCO story circles. And with storytelling, it's more about the sharing of one's own personal life experiences, not the performative or entertainment value found in some storytelling. So through all of that, then story circles emerged. And I think the participants are amazed at how simple it is, and yet how powerful it is. Total strangers come into UNESCO story circles, and they tell us that they leave feeling like they have new best friends. And it's amazing that can happen in such a relatively short amount of time.
Definitely.
Because it only takes about 45 minutes in the circle.
Yeah.
And persons become so deeply connected to each other in that amount of time.
Definitely. And really, when I think also of some experiences I have had with young professionals, with PhD students, or also with, master students, but also with educators. Sometimes there were tears of joy. Sometimes there were tears because people were so moved. And this was the moment when I got very, very triggered by the idea of appreciative inquiry, so that we frame the question, especially in the digital context, in such a way that it's about overcoming a challenge, that it's about learning from an experience. So that people really have got the chance to leave this very intense space and get back to something face to face, other activities, and maybe not necessarily with eyes filled with tears. How do you see this process of framing the questions?
Yeah, so that's something we really worked on, because again, there are many different purposes of circles, and it's absolutely all in the framing, to set that out. And so we actually worked on specific criteria for the framing, and that's in the manual, because it's really important that for UNESCO story circles to achieve the purpose of these particular circles, that the prompts be intercultural in nature.
Yeah.
And I want to note that intercultural here is increasingly being very broadly defined, that we're not just looking at cross-border or somehow, quote, national differences, but that the prompts are framed in such a way that they invite participants to share experiences they've had. For example, one of the ones that we use most often is to tell about a specific memorable experience you've had with someone who is different from you.
Yes.
And that difference is defined very broadly. It can be someone of a different generation, different gender, different religion, socioeconomic background, geographic location, including, let's say, urban and rural dichotomies. And so there's just, it's very broadly looked at. And so it's important to understand that. And then they share, but they don't just share. The prompts always lead a person to reflect on what did they learn about themselves in that interaction, what did they learn about others in that interaction. So it's not sufficient to just tell that story of a particular time, but it needs to go a step further to say, and what did you learn about yourself and others through that interaction?
Yeah.
And so the prompts have that element as well. And in the manual, there are examples of prompts that can be used.
Yeah.
Intercultural in nature. And then if a facilitator doesn't see any that are appropriate for that particular group or context, then there's the list of criteria to say you can develop your own intercultural prompt based on these criteria. So it's the methodology itself, the UNESCO Story Circle methodology itself is, while it's very structured and it's important to trust the process and follow the protocol, because there are 3 rounds of prompts. It's very important to follow that. That it's also very adaptable to the context and to the group, because the facilitator can select the best fit of the intercultural prompts for that particular context. So it's been amazing to see that, yes, the UNESCO Story Circles really do fit the criteria that UNESCO is looking for. And it fits very well because as I mentioned, we piloted in all 5 UNESCO regions around the world pre-pandemic, and then since online, and it really does work with so many different groups of people around the world. It does work for little to no resources, especially when in person. I mean, 2 of the pilots were literally done outside under trees. They don't need to be in a building even. So you don't need much of anything to actually do story circles. Of course, online, there's a little bit more. You need electricity, you need a device, you need the internet, etc. But we've seen many different people facilitating these all around the world. So it can really be facilitated by anyone. And it's just so inspirational to see how this all unfolds in so many different contexts around the world.
Yeah, this is exactly the point that I'm really happy you are emphasizing, that on one hand side, storytelling is really universal. We are wired, our brains are wired to tell stories and to make meaning in the narratives. Yeah, so when we listen to someone telling us something, we are making our own story based on our own approach. And this is exactly the point that, and again, I'm so grateful you have emphasized something that is also such an important aspect in the intercultural field, that of course, for decades, it has been clear to many, many professionals, and right now it's even more and more emphasized, that it's not about international differences. It's really about much, much more. The dialogue, the conversations, and also sharing stories across generations, across genders, across, as you have just said, people from different backgrounds. And this is exactly what guides me to one more question. You mentioned that it has been so powerful in many, many groups of people, many communities, indigenous people, also in the Middle East, that it feels so natural to share stories. Nevertheless, there are contexts when people really have to expand the comfort zone to share a personal experience. So this is the question. Are there any intercultural differences between the readiness to participate in the story circles from your point of view?
Yes, I mean, we certainly even knew that and heard that in the initial exploration through the focus groups and interviews we did, that in some cultures it's not very comfortable to talk about oneself in that way. And so there are a few examples of prompts in the manual that kind of put it out a little bit further, so it's not so personal. And so for those in contexts where it's not as appropriate to talk directly about oneself, there are prompts to help accommodate that. Another cultural difference that we noticed even in the pilots, so I mentioned it was a very structured protocol, 3 rounds, and there is a time element to it. And the reason why there's a time element is to ensure kind of we say a level playing field, at least during the time that persons are in the groups, that everybody gets the same amount of time. That's really important part of this protocol. And that time can be adjusted, but again, according to context. But in some of the pilots, some of the participants were like, you gotta be kidding, I have to tell my whole story in like 3 minutes. I can't even start in that amount of time. That's fine, if you want, but just everybody needs to have the same amount of time. So you can expand it, but you need to make sure everyone has the same amount of time. So it's been really amazing to work with story circles, again, both in person and online, all over the world, in South Africa and in Oman and in Costa Rica and just so many places around the world. It's just been incredible. And it's so inspirational. We were working with youth activists in Tunis, in Tunisia. They were such an inspiration to hear. We were working with young peacemakers in Cairo. Again, so inspirational to hear. And then working with teachers in different places around the world, and how they can take this back into their classrooms. There are just so many stories I could share with you about how amazing.
I hear that, and this is really such a pity that the conversations are only half an hour, 35 minutes, because I have exactly the same feeling that we could talk for ages, much longer. Darla, you have also just mentioned that it can be applied in so many contexts with so many groups, and obviously also in different cultural settings. And you have mentioned such exotic places, so immediately the smell of spices in Tunis or in Cairo entered my nose, and also this wonderful blue colors in Costa Rica. And this is exactly what happened in my case, that because of pandemics, traveling wasn't possible any longer. And I had the moment of despair. Okay, right now, what's next? And this is actually the story behind the one-word stories. When I said, if I cannot go to the world, I hope that people from the world are going to join me in this virtual space and spread this invitation, and also kept asking question, what is your one-word story that helped you during this really tricky time? And what is the story behind?
Yeah, so my one word is similar to some of your other guests I saw, but for me, that word is connection. And that, again, has kind of been with me for a long time, even before the pandemic, but has really been emphasized even more during these last 2 years, when all of us around the globe have faced isolation, have been physically separated from each other. I'm remembering early on in the pandemic, the videos of persons coming out on their balconies and connecting together through music, and just how meaningful that was to see that happen. How helpful it's been to have tools like Zoom now to help people connect despite the physical separation. So that connection piece is, to me, I feel like that shows that's what helps makes us human, is that we want to connect, We seek out opportunities to connect with each other. For me, though, connection is, as I mentioned, even before the pandemic, I've always enjoyed connecting people to each other and connecting ideas, looking at what are the different themes, how do they fit together, how can they connect together. And in terms of the connecting people and ideas, one manifestation of that is that I had seen within intercultural competence, basically, if you work with humans, you need intercultural competence. If you're never going to ever have any contact with humans, maybe you're okay, but it's very rare. And so, as intercultural competence is there, no matter what sector, what you do. At the same time, I saw that each sector had their own specialists, their own researchers doing work around intercultural competence, and so. Intercultural competence looks a little different in engineering or in social work or in healthcare. And yet they weren't talking to each other oftentimes. And so that led me to actually start the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence. And its mission, the key word in its mission is connection. It's about connecting researchers, practitioners, students, policymakers across languages, borders, sectors, so that we can learn more with and from each other in advancing the practice of intercultural and global competence. And that it has been so amazing. The World Council officially launched as a global nonprofit at the very beginning of the pandemic. And during the pandemic, we've been able to continue connecting with each other literally around the world. There are numerous working groups, and it's just been so exciting to see that happen with people from all around the world connecting. There's a working group on intercultural competence in virtual learning. There's one on community-based intercultural competence. There's one on assessment intercultural competence, which is another area of my research and work as well. But there's so many. There's one on looking at intercultural competence and policymakers, and anyone can join these working groups. So it's all available. It's at www.iccglobal.org, and we are learning so much, again, with and from each other as we connect, and that has become so important now more than ever. So I'm really excited about being able to help make those connections happen.
I love it. I love it because, pandemics has actually taught us one very important thing, that it's about willingness, the willingness to connect, and not trying to search for excuses. Oh, it won't work in the virtual space. Oh, it feels artificial to talk about something more personal than just business. Oh, I don't want to because whatever. That it's really the first most important aspect also of working in story circles, by the way, to come with openness, to come with curiosity, to come with readiness, to really connect, to get to know each other, but also, as you have said, one of the tasks is to write down a little bit about the process and also the self-reflection. So also to get to know yourself. We are who we are because of our human beings. And this is also something that is so important currently. It also actually takes me to one more comment, because in the intercultural field, as you have emphasized, we talk actually really a lot about diversity and inclusion. We talk more and more about belonging, which is fantastic. And this is also the part with the connection, that when we have this willingness to really listen to another person, and listen, not to respond immediately, not to comment immediately, not to interrupt and say, oh yes, exactly the same happened to me, but really to listen with the intention to hear what is going on inside this person when he, she, they share their stories, then we can really learn a lot. This is really something fantastic. Yeah, that the person who is speaking is repeating what they already know. As soon as they switch to the mode of listening, they start learning. They start to learn.
Absolutely. That's really one of the key skills practiced through UNESCO story circles that we emphasize a lot is that is listening for understanding, not for response or judgment. That oftentimes it's just natural as humans that we listen for response or judgment. How will I respond to you? What is my opinion of what you're saying? But in both of those cases, I'm actually focusing more on me, right?
Yeah.
And so with listening for understanding, it's much more about focusing 100% on the other person, what they're saying, to free ourselves from the need to necessarily respond, to give ourselves fully into that listening to the other person, to the words they're saying, to the nonverbals, to how they're saying it. There's so much that can go into that listening for understanding, and connection really starts with that listening piece.
Darla, thank you so much. It was really wonderful. As you have seen, we have started with storytelling and intercultural competence, move towards pragmatic approach, how to apply storytelling practices in the story circles. And we are just landing with some comments on story listening. What a journey. Thank you so much. I wish you all the best for all your projects and lots of satisfaction with facilitating story circles and with hearing from the participants that something has changed, something has moved them, and that they are not seeing the intercultural work as something that has to be done, but really can enjoy it much more.
Thank you so much for this time together. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much.